Thank you, Dad, for the very kind introduction. You didn't have to, maybe you sort of had to. It's wonderful to see all you familiar faces. It's fun to come home and reconnect with you guys. So I thought tonight we'd talk just a little bit about the behind the scenes, the process of making something like this. And like Dad said, this is a project that from the inception, we started everything, every movie we create, you start just by talking about an idea. You have to go and sort of sell it into, in this case, to the studio, and they have to agree, okay, let's spend some money and let's develop an idea. And we decided this is a time when, you know, the studio's interested in telling some of these stories again in a different way. And so we talked about Lady and the Tramp. Okay, let's do that. And we started the process. We hired a screenwriter. I met a guy in Austin who was an interesting independent writer. The studio said, we are actually launching a new initiative, Disney Plus, which is going to be a very meaningful new business for them. In fact, I think in the future of entertainment for companies like Disney and others, you really have to have a streaming platform because that's the wave of the future of media. We're all, even now expecting just to find things on our mobile devices, find things on demand, and we've seen that with companies like Netflix and Amazon and others. So Disney said we have to be in that business and we need titles that would have otherwise maybe gone to theaters, but we want to put it on the streaming service. So they had selected that point, Lady and the Tramp, to do that. And so we actually, we said, great. It didn't really adjust our thinking as producers and writers and eventually directors. We made it the same way. We just knew that the distribution was going to go straight to this platform. But that launched us, and so I put together this little deck, and since 1994 I started at an entry level as an assistant, and over the years I got more responsibility, and it was around 99 when I had actual responsibility of working on the movies and having input, and that became more significant as I got a more senior position. And so I've worked, I last count, it was about, about 45 projects since then. And these were all ones, all up until Jungle Book, those are ones I worked on as an executive, and then it was starting with Jungle Book where I switched jobs into producing, where you really, it's like going, in my comparison, my analogy, it's like going from someone who is sort of this general contractor overseeing a project from a distance to being, the foreman on the ground day to day, which is actually what I've preferred because it allows me to get my fingers dirty and to be involved in the millions of little decisions that happen every day that help get the movie made. And so that's been the last 5+ years. So we can move forward. So this was an amazing sort of opportunity. These classic animated films are ones that have been incredibly impactful for me, made great impressions on me. This one is one of my earliest memories. And it's unique in the sense that a lot of the Disney films were based on fairy tales or previous works and that were adapted. This is something that was actually original story that was sort of the combination of two short stories that they generated. One was generated by someone in the story department, one was another short story. And it was also very much informed by Walt's own passion for dogs. He had, I think in the next slide, there it is. You have, on the left, you have Walt and Lillian with one of their chows. But he was very fond of his dogs, and on the right you see one of the story artists actually adapting this Cocker Spaniel model into Lady. But it was something that was kind of unique and amazing. It came out in 1955, the same year Mom and Dad were married, the same year the Disney park opened. And Main Street USA, which was very much inspired by Walt's sort of fond memories of Marceline, Missouri, his Midwestern upbringing, is very much echoed in this movie. As in the animated movie, if any of you have any recollection of that, you're coming into this Anytown, USA, around the turn of the century, and it's got this wonderful bucolic feel. And we decided that's something we wanted to also replicate in this movie. We talked about, should it be contemporary? And we said, no, we want it to be period. We wanted to evoke that same feeling. So we were very excited about the opportunity to be able to retell the story in a new medium. Let's go ahead. And so this is just a slide. This is from Jungle Book. And so I was very familiar with this process, having lived for 2 years in making this movie, which is, you see a kid there, is a kid that we actually photographed. In this case, he was in a small little tank we built in a parking lot. But everything beyond the kid, other than the water that's touching him, is all digital. It's all a visual effect. And so that decision was made because none of the animals that we were envisioning in this movie could be real. None of them at a scale or the types of animals you could train. And so once you understood that, you realized all those characters were going to be animated And it was simpler, therefore, to have everything that they interacted with was going to be animated. And so it was very much a controlled process because there was no way we're going to train, a massive bear or a panther or a gigantic, orangutan. It was just the way it needed to be. But when you started considering a movie that was starring dogs, we knew it was a very different consideration. We could train dogs. We live in a society where it's still, it's acceptable. We've learned more about, the treatment, the proper humane treatment of animals, and dogs are still ones, if you do it right, it's okay to use them as working animals. And also it was very, very practical. And so we said, there's no reason why we just animate them for the entire time. And yet they also have to speak, and they have to interact, and they have to have very specific performance timing. So we knew we needed to create what we call a hybrid, where we would actually cast real dogs, and then when they needed to talk and do specific things, they'd be animated. And that was actually a huge challenge. Let's go forward. So knowing that this is obviously Tramp as he exists in the 55 film, and that was our model, because we at this point needed to go out into the world and find this dog. And not only just find this dog, we realized it was important to us, the filmmaking team, to rescue this dog. We know we also live in a world where there's a lot of animals that need homes. We know that the theme of this movie, among other things, but the most important theme in my mind was that everyone deserves a loving home. And so how could we not make our best efforts to go and actually find dogs who needed just that? And he, of all people, as a character, is this homeless mutt, and so we said at this point in the process, we had gathered a dog training team, very early days. They had good friends that were very connected to the rescue networks all across the country. And we said, let's go look for this guy. And so that began a process where we hung back, and every once in a while a photo would show up in our inbox. And it was on a day that I think the next photo showed up that we felt like we had found our guy. And so we said, oh, who's this? And we said, this is Monty. Monty was at a shelter in Arizona. He was found on the roadside in New Mexico, had wound up subsequently in something they call a kill shelter. He was rescued from that and put in this other shelter. Halo Rescue is the name of the organization, and he was there. And so we go to the next slide. There he is in front of where he was living at the time. And we said, we really like the look of Monty, let's go get him. And we went and got him. Our team, actually adopted him and took him in and took on foster responsibility. And that began a process where they wanted to sort of test his personality and this and that. And everything was really good. And so we felt like we had our Tramp. And we knew our deadlines, before, we knew we needed at least 16 weeks of training for any of these animals. And so we were hitting these hard deadlines of having them in our possession and with our trainers and working ready to shoot. So Monty came to us first. We were then set about, waiting and looking at these pictures. It was a little bit simpler looking for Lady because we knew we were looking for a Cocker Spaniel. And just so happened there was one that was living with a family they were looking to adopt her out. They were looking, I think they had more than they could handle. And so I think let's try the next slide. Well, obviously there's how she looks, and that's, we wanted all this. And this doesn't quite exist in the real world. Animators can take license with their design, and those sort of party colors and the breakdown of colors doesn't really exist, and we scan just, random reference photos online. But we wanted to get as close as we could to this beautiful femininity, her floppy ears portraying like long hair, and the nice color separation on her muzzle and face, and we said, we'll see what we can find. But then next slide came in, and here's Rose. She wasn't exactly that, but we loved, when we looked at all these different, initially we were being very superficial. We're just looking at the face, and she had these features and these proportions, and she was really cute. We also noticed that she'd been clipped very closely. She'd been shaved because she was living out in Utah, and she was, part of a hunting group of dogs, and so they clipped them down. And we said, okay, we like her, let's bring her, let's adopt her, and let's see how she does, and if we like her, then we can always let her hair grow, right? And so let's go to the next slide, Dad. And so this, if you click once again, it's just a little clip. We just saw her, and it gave us, hit it one more time. So we saw how alert and how sort of energetic she was, and we felt like, okay, she could be our girl. And so we went through the same process. And for me, my next interaction with these dogs was when they were brought out by our trainers from where they were. Like I said, she's in Utah, and Monty was was in Arizona, and I'm not going to bore you with, we had many other dogs to find, but I'm just going to focus on our leads for now. And so we had them, we felt good about our choices, and we brought them to what we called a play date. And there was a park not far from our studio. We had to see how they actually interacted. And we had, truth be told, we had more than one selection for each of these roles. And we wanted to look at them together. We wanted to see how they interacted. We also wanted to see how they looked scale-wise together. And so this all-important first date, if we look at the next slide, was right here. This was that day. We were over in a park in Burbank. And it was really sweet. And what you don't see here is the very first time they met, Tramp, Monty that is, sort of got right up close to her, and she sort of stood up. She looked very cautiously down to the ground, and then she took a nip at him, and she said, "You're too close, pal." He said, "Okay, okay," and he went over here, and then slowly she warmed to him, and we thought, "Oh my goodness, this is a disaster." But very shortly thereafter, she warmed to him, and she just let him know that she was in charge, and she never let him forget that. She was always in charge. But we said, we think we have our team, and then we took them in the next slide to there's just a little shot of them together, the first little sniff. And let's go to the next one. This was their final edition. We had taken into the studio. This is a bunch of studio personnel. We see our head of music. We see our head of franchise, the head of physical production. Those are our trainers that we embarrassed them by making dress in these period conductor uniforms. I don't know why. But this was basically me, where we got the final blessing from the studio apparatus to say, okay, we like your dogs. And we were off. Let's go to the next slide. So this is Monty again, standing set. One challenge of the kind of film when you're gonna have your lead actors are animals, is that you have to go into production with more than one animal for any number of contingencies. And sometimes it's certain behaviors that you're not going to get. Sometimes it's you never want to overwork your animal. If there's a running scene, something like that, you always need to have some sort of backup. And yet we found this sort of very unique, one-of-a-kind mutt. He doesn't even have any pure lineage, and we said, how are we going to find, let alone rescue, someone who could pass for this guy? But we kept looking, and lo and behold, in a shelter up in Humboldt County, in the next slide, we found Billy Idol right there. And so Billy was always recognizable. That right ear was always sort of cocked on one, and the other one was down. He was a funny character, but he was really skilled, and he was a great backup, and we were like, oh, we couldn't have been more fortunate. And so we were able to go into production, and of course we also had a handful of other Cocker Spaniels that became part of our family to be backups they ultimately did a few of their own behaviors, but the real burden was shared by Monty and Rose. Let's go to the next slide. So once we had our cast, we chartered this jet, flew them from Los Angeles out to Savannah, Georgia, where we were prepping this show. We had scouted, movies like this, you are looking, at locations that both offer you wonderful looks and things that you think will creatively sort of give you what you need. But you also have to look, practically speaking, where you're going to actually get some sort of tax incentive. Georgia has a wonderful production-friendly tax incentive, and it just so happens that Savannah in Georgia is this amazing, if any of you have been there, some of you are nodding here, it's this amazingly sort of well-preserved, one of the oldest cities in the country. And you couldn't go anywhere without looking at buildings that weren't over 100 years old. And so it provided us this amazing backdrop and back lot for it. So anyway, this is our team landing in Savannah. There's Diane, our production coordinator. And the next shot, we saw they just took up residence, came right into our production offices, and felt right at home. It was a converted elementary school that had been closed down in little community of Thunderbolt. And it was great because each of us had a wing, each division had a wing in this and I felt really big and adult walking around, and all the chairs are still these tiny little kid chairs, and you see there's maps and dry erase boards, but we also had a whole wing for our animals. And we also had a lot of outdoor grassy space where they could be trained and where they could frolic with each other, and it was great. So we were into this process now, this 16 weeks of training. Meanwhile, I had some other business to attend to. I had to go back to London at the time, where another film was being worked on. And I said to this team, I will see you guys, I'll get back here as quickly as I can. And it turned out to be about 10 weeks later. And the one thing, that we said, do not touch Rose's hair. Let it grow as long as it possibly can, and then we'll do what we can, because we were really desiring to have that long, nice feminine ears. And so I went away. Let's click to the next slide. So this what you're looking at here, that's how she sort of looked when we got her on the left. This is a Photoshop on the right. That's not real. So we said, this is kind of what we're aiming for, right? This is, if we were lucky, kind of what we would hope to see at the end of the day, and where we'd sort of smooth out some of the coloring on her muzzle, we'd have longer hair and trim it just so. So that was the vision. And so I got back and said, okay, let's see Rose, and we saw this. And I couldn't believe my eyes. I thought that we were, honestly, I didn't think we could use her. I had no idea that the hair didn't grow naturally in short hair and long than this and that. She was just Chewbacca, and she was unrecognizable. And this is her testing little props, and I was honestly, and my colleagues could tell you, I was pretty freaked out. And I said, we need, and we didn't have much time. We did not have much time, and honestly, we couldn't really swap out easily because all this training had been done. And so we need hair and makeup. We need a specialist. We need a dog grooming specialist. And we talked to our team, and they said, we think we know someone. She lives in London, and she specializes in amazing sort of design work with dogs. And I think the next slide can tell you this Sue right there. And that's one of her creations. That's one of her poodles in a prize-winning design where you see the swan over here, you see the Japanese gal over here, and then, like, you know, Brian May over there. This is what she does in her off hours, but she was, by all accounts, she was a real genius when it came to working with dogs. So she was flown out to us. We said, you have 1 week to work with us. And so I think the next slide is just, if we go to the next slide, she's working her thing. We were considering extensions. She was working with colors. She was working with all these techniques to trim out her muzzle, all these things. And we had many reviews that were not quite sufficient. And finally, I think we got to the next slide. There's her working away still. That's some poodle hair extensions that weren't quite cutting the mustard. The next slide, I think finally, so this is what we sort of were working with. And then what we finally ended up with was, the next slide was this. And so that was a lot of sweat and tears and anxiety to get Rose camera ready. And then Sue never left. She was with us the entire production. In fact, she was flown back as recently as just weeks ago for publicity to keep doing her hair and makeup. For every time Rose was going for publicity, we needed Sue, always at her side. So then we set about filming this movie, and this is our director Charlie, and that's our script supervisor. We had this, bizarre and wonderful process where you're on a set and you're working with your regular human cast, your actors. You had dogs that you had to be very sort of specifically prepared for. It was hot and steamy, and they had to have their own tent that was cooled and ready every time between shots. We don't want them tired and panting. So they were really well taken care of, but you had to be sort of patient, and you had to be reasonable in your demands of what you think they could do performance-wise. And so we had amazing trainers, and we had an amazing process. Let's move forward, Dad. So now this is a moment, is in the middle of the schedule, and truth be told, this, in my opinion, this spaghetti scene with Lady and the Tramp, which is sort of the pinnacle of these two characters from opposite sides of the tracks coming together and finding their mutual interest in each other. It may be, I think, among the top 10 most recognizable scenes in cinema history. I don't think you can go anywhere in this world where they don't have a point of reference for that moment when they're chewing their spaghetti and they have an accidental kiss. It just was a magical moment. And so we knew that we felt as much pressure, or more pressure than any other moment in the movie, just somehow deliver on this scene. And so it took a lot of training. We also knew there would be animation involved, just to have the very precise timing and all that. But still, we wanted the dogs trained and ready to be in position. And we also had to create a mood. We'd scouted a place, this alley near the Riverwalk in Savannah. And so that was a whole story unto itself. And you guys can only be the judges of whether it worked or not. But this is what's going on behind the scenes. For every time you saw that intimate little moment, you turn the camera around like I did, and this is what's happening. So you see right now 3 different camera angles running. You have behind the scenes cameras, you have focus pullers, you have 3 or 4 different trainers with those little treat sticks, you have visual effects coordinators, you have focus pullers. And if I pulled out wider, you'd see much, much more. But this is the circus that we had to sort of travel with every moment. And so when you find yourself next watching a scene like this, know that this is what's really going on. But that said, it was a magical moment. And everyone, I would say on the crew, everyone had a reference point for this movie. They all knew the project they're working on, and they all knew the importance of the scene. And so once we felt like we had it in the can, it was 3 days of shooting, because it was, the getting into the scene, it was the setting up of the meal, then eating the meal, it was the singing of the song, all that stuff. We had 3 days to do it, 3 nights rather. And I think we all had a wonderful sigh of relief and some spontaneous applause once we felt like we finally had it. So now the rest of the shoot was, it was unique, because I said we had these wonderful furry 4-legged co-stars. And so even when you were working or not working, you had these wonderful moments. And I would see, let's just sort of, the next couple, it's just our cast and others having these wonderful down moments, and everyone it was such an infectious thing to have them around. They were great, they were friendly. Everyone had, let's see the next one. Here's Don Devine, a wonderful Bay Area product. He'd always wear his Giants hat, and I'd always commend him for that. But he, every day, would always get a little moment with Rose or someone, and you could tell they just got a boost, because days are long and they're hard, and we'd work for 14 hours, and it wasn't easy work, and it was hot. But anything that gave us this advantage, it was wonderful, and these dogs really gave us a nice pick-me-up. That's Charlie with Monty. What's the next one? That's Tammy, one of our trainers, that's actually not Rose, but that is either Brody or, not Harley, who's the other one? Brady. And he had tremendous hops, and so there's a scene specifically where he needed someone leaping like that, and that's what he did. But she's having fun, and what's the next one? That's Stitch, who played Bull, the bulldog, he was just that. He was a bowling ball of energy, and you had to watch your shins when he was on set, rolling around, but he was lovable. And what's the next one? That's actually one of our screenwriters, Carrie, posing with Monty. Again, just getting the wonderful affection. What's next? That was me. That's Tommy Boy, and we had, some of you have seen the movie, some of you have not. There was one of the few changes. We had several, we made some decisions in terms of adaptations to make with the story. And one of the things we also thought important to sort of be very aware of the current situation, and because we have a lot of dogs that need to be put down every year, and we're trying to find ways to be more responsible. And as a company, Disney is also trying to message the most responsible thing. And so rather than, famously in the animated film at the end, you cut to obviously you flash forward a number of months, and there's Lady and Tramp, and they have their little litter of 3, somehow improbably 3 little perfectly purebred Cocker Spaniels and 1 Tramp. Go figure. But we talked long and hard about, we would rather show that there's a lot of loving dogs out there that need homes. And so we featured these little urchin puppies, and they wound up being adopted at the end, just as a way to sort of make a more direct message. So that was Tommy Boy, and there's Stitch again, and then we can go to that slide you were on. So anyway, we got to the end. What you see in this picture, and again, I don't want to bore you with these details, but this was the inside of a Victorian house, which was a stage we built in a warehouse. All the exteriors we shot in and around Savannah. But you see these funny looking molded styrofoam dogs down here, because like I said, we had, and you even see a fake stuffed cat somewhere sort of center left, because anytime we knew that there was going to be a digital version of the animal in there, and even if it wasn't going to be a live animal shot, we wanted these were scans and these foam carvings, so we'd actually see the actual scale. And we had models sitting and standing, so we could line up. They were like stand-ins for us, and we could figure out where the focus was. All the technical things you need to understand as you're lining up a shot, because it takes 20-30 minutes between every setup. And so that's what we used, and we had a lot of techniques to imagine where the dogs were going to be without having the dogs. And sometimes we, in fact, couldn't use the dogs if it was a precarious situation or something like that. So we had all these weird props around, and there's a sequence with cats, and we knew we were never going to use cats on camera, because there's long history teaching us to never try to do that. You lose a whole day. So they're only animated, and so we just had those nice stuffed little animals. So we finally got to the point where we finished shooting, and then but you're not even halfway done with your movie at that point, because as I said, we had so much animation to accomplish. And so this was, and again, as compared to something like Jungle Book, where every character was animated, so they were only ever going to be that way. There was never going to be a comparison on screen between a digital bear and a real bear. In our movie, in every scene, there's going to be an on-screen comparison for you to look at and say, here's a real dog, and then here's a digital dog. And so the bar was that much higher in terms of finding a digital match and being that precise, both in the digital asset that you build and also how it behaves. So we took, you know, during this time, we started the process, and we can go to the next slide. Here is just several slides of Monty standing on a stage surrounded by no less than like 200 some odd still cameras, and all those compositing to get, you know, a digital scan of that character. And so we did that for him. I think the next slide is us doing the same thing for Rose. And of course, we were so pressed for time. You see, she hadn't even gone through her hair and makeup, so we had to do that again. She's got her woolly mammoth look at this point. But that's where we start, and then our visual effects team takes those assets and they start building. And it takes them weeks and weeks and weeks to start building this digital asset of any of these characters. And so let's go to the next slide. So this is, if you click play, you're going to see what we call a turntable. Let's click it again, Dad. So this is just you know, obviously a still asset, but the first thing that's rendered with all the detail, and it's just zooming around and giving you slightly different angles on the lighting. And that's the first thing we look at, and we say, okay, it's looking okay. But we're all really holding our breath until the day we get our first motion test back, where you're actually rendering something moving through space. And so if we click the next slide, this was the very first thing we ever saw, and believe me, it was very late in the process. We had about only 35 weeks of post-production on this, which, trust me, it was not a long time. And so we were pretty anxious about it. So this was the first thing we saw if you click play, or just hit it again. And once again, we felt a sense of relief, because you can see that's Rose on the day up there on the right. And that was the first moving digital asset. And we said, okay, there's a lot of things you notice right away that aren't working. Her face is not even rigged to move. The coat, the groom, as we call it, you know, her fur was a little long here and there. But if you weren't looking too close, you said, you know what, that might pass as a real dog. And so we knew that at least at a baseline, we might, you know, be able to get away with it. So we had to wait then for the first test for Monty. Let's go to the next slide. And the same thing. And this was the first motion test we saw. So we can click play. And again, the animators are obviously just mimicking the movement that they see in the actual reference photography. And so that's Monty on the right, and that's digital Monty on the left. He proved to be probably the trickiest asset. I was working with two major VFX studios. One was in London, a company called Frame Store, and then another company in New Zealand called Weta. Both very, you know, very capable, very seasoned visual effects houses. But they, you know, as we got deep into the process, would tell me they've never had a tougher task, because, again, in a given scene, you're going between one and the other. So there was no room for error. And if you pay close attention to this guy, he's just got the most unique, scruffy amount of fur going in this random different directions. He's a very particular, very detailed character, and it made it extremely hard. Like the smallest thing could betray the effect. And you know, I don't think every shot in the movie is as good as the other, but I think most of them pass the smell test. You know, when we make a movie, we're first and foremost trying to engage an audience with a story that hopefully has some worthwhile messages and also can entertain you along the way and have you feel something. Those are the kind of major goals in mind when we set off to make a movie. Sometimes there's other, you know, worthwhile stories embedded in a project. And this one, like I said at the top of this presentation, we felt like there was a very sort of positive message to say about the idea of adopting these animals. There's so many that are in need of it, and not everyone's right for that, but those who are, it's something we want to sort of bring that to people's attention. And so we created a piece that we used as part of not just marketing, but also messaging.
Okay. Guys, something very special happened this morning. I got my collar. Yep, officially part of the family.
And cut.
That was nice. You did a good job.
Pretty great. In many ways, this story is a story about rescuing animals.
A big portion of the dogs that we used on the film needed rescuing. They came from a pound or a shelter or foster homes, and we looked all over the country.
In the case of Monty, he was stray.
And Monty.
He's the most remarkable dog.
I'm Mark. Oh, he's really charming, gentle, and has so much soulfulness in his eyes. And he couldn't have been more perfect for Tramp.
Maybe another perfect day. When I finally saw Monty, it's one of those great things that you immediately kind of get him. Because the dog just by nature has a certain attitude about him. Same with Lady, who looks very sort of put together and beautiful.
Rose was living with an owner who felt like she needed a job because she was very active and was not going to be a sit on your lap kind of dog. And we found her and we said, we think we might have a job for her.
When Rose and Monty, our two stars, met, it was very clear they were right for each other.
Nice to meet you, Lady.
These dogs started from scratch. The whole team got them so focused and connected. It was amazing to watch.
I thought they just looked so perfect and they were so darling together.
It's a real pleasure to see these dogs thrive in a way that they hadn't been able to. And they received so much love being on set. And quite frankly, there's nothing quite as regenerating as the affection you get from one of these dogs.
I know. Really couldn't get any better.
As a team and as a crew, we all believe in rescuing animals.
I've always had rescue animals growing up, and there's something really incredible about giving them a second chance.
There's something about the look in a dog's eyes. They are just incredibly endearing. They have this loyalty, especially rescue dogs. There's something very special about that bond. Thank God.
Well, that concludes our presentation portion, but just to have an open Q&A conversation about anything regarding this or movies in general. We could talk about the current releases or the upcoming award season. Yes?
Purely from a technical point of view, social issues aside, would it be technically possible at this point to do a movie like this entirely digitally?
Absolutely, you could. You are. There's an issue of cost. Doing that, the cost goes up. It's not, it's not nothing to put a whole dog team together. That has a cost too. But we wanted this movie, like the animated version of this movie exists and it's lovely, the 1955 version. We wanted something that was completely grounded and real, which gives you kind of a very different, I think, emotional relationship to it. And so we wanted every time that, and going back to that Walt slide and what draws people to material that sort of features the human-dog relationship, it's because it's ingrained, and for not all of us, but many of us, it's just something that's very important and emotional. So we wanted that as well as we could, and I think that without the interaction on camera with real dogs and the human actors, it would have been something different. So there's to me, there's an emotional component to having the animation try to live up to the real, and then there's also just a practical conversation. But you can do it. In fact, a movie that I'm working on some post-production and it'll come out next summer, there is, and it's based on a book called The One and Only Ivan, which is loosely based on a true story about a silverback gorilla that was kept in captivity for 27 years in a strip mall in Tacoma. But there's a little scroungy sort of mutt dog in that, and there's a poodle, and there's other animals that easily could have been live action animals on set. But because we were never going to have a gorilla or the elephants or other animals in the movie other than digitally, we decided to make all the animals digital. And there was both an artistic and a practical. So it really depends on, I think, the balance that you have in the script of what you're looking for. But yes is the short answer. I gave you the long answer, sorry. Yes?
So first off, I love your production name. I don't know
Oh, thank you.
if anybody caught it. Tell them what your
Oh, the company name, TaylorMade.
TaylorMade.
Yeah, so if you're a golfer, you've heard of that one before, but it was a little too easy.
So that's number one. And number two, thank you for continuing to make family-friendly movies. Really
Yeah.
appreciate that.
I've been happy to be sort of stuck there at Disney for 25 years. I started, when I was coming up the ranks, it was apparent to me that not everyone who worked there in a creative capacity was there because of their specific love for family films. And that's not a huge judgment, it's just sometimes talented people getting jobs and it's a way station, they're looking for something else. I love all kinds of movies, not just family films. I love all genres, but you want me to be center? But I never felt anything other than a passion for working on family films, and obviously in the last 20 years, raising my own family. So it's always been an honor to do these kinds of films.
Can I ask you also about the opening? Because it's beautiful coming in over the town.
Yeah.
Was that like done with a drone and then
Yeah.
staged and?
Yeah, obviously you were part of the film group that saw the movie, and for those of you, if you didn't see the movie just opens like the animated film with an illustrated, image of a town, turn of the century, and it moves in on that, and it resolves into a real image, which was a drone shot. And it's Lafayette Square. Once it becomes real, we're looking at Lafayette Square in Savannah, but surrounding that is a lot of digital extension because you would see a lot of modernity and other things that we didn't want. And it also, once you pushed, and it's one long tracking shot into the trees, and once you go into the trees, those are all digital because the street that you find on the other side of the trees was not there. So we were stitching all that together. And at some point, if you watch closely, you'll see my son Henry running through that street scene. He looks like a little ant, but he's very recognizable the way he carries his elbows up like this. So yeah, yes, Mom.
Does that boat, the boat exist, or did you guys build it?
Yeah, the one that the dogs are on in that scene, in that slide, it's the Delta Lady. It's a real boat. We didn't have to do too much to it. It's sort of, a period-looking boat. We did have to. There is a riverboat there in Savannah, the Georgia, whatever it was called, the Georgia Lady or something. But that was too big and didn't suit our purpose. So this one we actually had to have steam down from some more distant location, and just having that boat in the movie. I'm not going to bore you, but it was a nightmare. It was a fun thing to have a visual, breakup to the dogs to get on the river. There's a scene that didn't exist in the original movie, but it entailed getting this thing down. We, right when we were tying that off to a dock and shooting a scene, a dock we had to build because it didn't exist, and trucking all this stuff. High winds started coming in, hurricanes were blowing through, we had to shut it down, we had to leave, we had to cut short the day, we had to leave and go to another location, we had to come back to it. It was kind of the bane of our existence, but the boat was real. So, yes, Don.
This is kind of awkward, but I gotta ask it.
Oh, I love awkward questions.
This is not about the dogs, but it's about the people.
Oh.
And you noticed they were racially mixed.
Yes.
I think was one of the most touching things in the movie.
Yeah.
Tell me about how deliberate that was.
It was very deliberate. We're always looking, and I think that we want our movies, I think in a very, you can look at it from several perspectives. Looking at it from a pure business perspective, you want movies to relate to our audience that's out there, and you want to find representation for your audience that's out there. There are movies that feel like they really require the sort of diligence of history about, this is not that movie. It's a movie about talking dogs. And just because we happen to be turn of the century, we didn't feel beholden to that level of accuracy in terms of how people would have interacted and behaved or been accepted one way or the other. We felt absolute freedom to cast what we would call just a colorblind movie. And so we set about to do that, and without real consideration, because we felt like this is not a historical piece. It's just a setting. So that was the decision. Yes, Daryl.
Do you have to pitch the movie to Disney? How do you sell them the idea if they want to fund it and do it? So yeah, that stage always has to happen, and it happens in different ways. In this case, there's a very, I'm very close, I'm pitching to people that I was working among for many years, and so it's a very kind of casual beginning of that conversation, especially if it's a known title like this. And so the executive that I was talking to earlier, we both agreed, we like this title, maybe there's something there. And at that point, so there's a very sort of unofficial chain of communication. And then my job, given that I knew there was interest in looking to develop this in a new way, I went off and found a writer and then developed a more specific take on that and came back to her, and that was the more formal version of the conversation with a writer in hand. And she heard enough to know that she liked it, and then it was her job. She has to sell it to a boss who says yes to that development money, because the first money you have to spend, at least in this process at a studio, is the money you spend on a writer. And even a cheap writer can be easily $100,000, and so that's where it begins. And that was the sort of the run-up, the unofficial run-up, and then the official start.
And then that just begins the process to try to get something to actually get made.
And how long was it from that point to when the movie was finished?
So yeah, depending on where you count. Like if you start counting time, and I would have to guess because my mind doesn't work that way, but if you start counting from the moment I just went and had, you know, brunch with Andrew, the first writer in Austin, that would have been, you know, probably closer to 2.5 years ago. But if you really talk about the moment when he was beginning to write and the studio decided, in this case, because they knew this Disney Plus was coming, we're the beneficiaries of more focused thinking, saying, let's get this done. Oftentimes in my business, it's like, let's think about that. Come back and let's talk about it again. Oh, do some, you know, try something different, come back again, because sometimes there's no imperative and you just wind up spinning and it can be very frustrating. It's always a gift when there is some sort of downward pressure saying, we need this. I had that on Jungle Book just because we had a competitive situation and the guy at the top said, you're gonna do this. And so we had the pressure of getting it done, but we had the benefit of no one stopping at every juncture and saying, okay, are we gonna spend the next tranche of money? I don't, you know, that is common too. So in this case, we had the benefit, like, we need this. Come November 12th, there's gonna be a movie on that streaming service. And believe me, we sort of nearly died having to hit those deadlines because by the time we said, go do it, we didn't have that much time. That was 18 months. So back to your question, from the time I said we are making this to the time we really started spending money, hired a director, and we're really prepping something, that was 18 months. And so for a movie with over, I don't know, 1,500, you know, complex visual effects shots, that's extremely tight. You'd want 24 months, honestly, to do that. Peter.
I have a two-part question. Number one, how do you, in the world of streaming, with this new Disney streaming platform, how are you going to measure the success of the film?
Right.
And then secondly, 5 years from now, are we going to be all watching things on our television, or will there still be theaters?
Right. I'm not sure you could all hear Peter. He's got a very soft voice, but he's asking how do you measure success initially, and then where are we going to be in the future? And I'll guess. The first part of the question is all this data will come back to the studio. I am waiting to see how they share that with us as filmmakers. It doesn't really impact us one way or the other. We've done the job. We've been paid for our job. We've delivered the movie. But honestly, I mean, they care very much about their consumer behavior and what gets watched. And so in the streaming world, that's a very precise measurement. It remains to be seen how how open they are with that. I'm very much hoping that we'll get a sense of how that measures how many people are viewing it, for how long. And I'm sure there's dozens of other ways to gauge interaction. So I think that'll be interesting and very helpful for them to determine like where we keep spending money. Like, is everyone just watching these little 3-minute Forky shorts from Pixar? Or they care about feature films? Are they just watching the reality show? Is it just Star Wars? So wherever the eyes and clicks are going, you'll see more investment, and that's one of the benefits of work. I mean, it's not like you don't have immediate reaction in theaters too. You see what works and what doesn't, but it's a little more binary there. I do think when you ask the question about what's the future of distribution, I think this streaming is only growing. I think that we have more and more sophisticated ways to play back, ways that are technically pretty good. Also, just the convenience of it is something that we are in the next generation, and your grandkids are just like, that's it. And I want to believe that there's always going to be, and right now, by the way, theatrical films, those that go out into theaters, it's still a very robust business. You're talking about billions and millions of dollars in revenue every year. It's a relatively flat, it's been growing overseas. Big markets like China have gone up, even with the sort of tricks of conversion. But it is kind of plateaued. But there's so much money there, I think it's there for a while. My hunch, and it's just that, in the future, that can become more of a specialized thing about going. I think we're always, as a human species, going to want to go out. Going to go out for dinner, even if you have a kitchen, right? You're going to go out to see a movie, even if you have a TV. But it can become ever more specialized, and I think the people who maintain good theatrical experiences, meaning they maintain their theaters and have good, I think that can continue to draw you, and types of films that sort of speak to you in ways like, I want to see that with a bunch of people. That could speak to comedy or spectacle or other things. Sometimes I think smaller, more niche movies that are just more character-based and quieter, oftentimes I think I see it anecdotally, like I'll watch that at home. I'll watch that on Netflix, I'll watch it somewhere else. But the nice thing is that, and I'll finish with this, that I myself, my early slide I showed you, a lot of the movies I worked on were what I call these inspirational dramas. And most of them were sports themed, like Miracle, Remember the Titans, The Rookie, movies like that. Those had a place in the market where you could earn some money. The last one I made was in 2014, it's called $1 Million Arm, true story, again, it's set in the baseball world, an inspirational story. But you could just see the audience was getting harder and harder to get into theaters for those. And sometimes that's the idea, but the quality was kind of similar. It was just harder to sort of cut through the noise of much bigger films. And so at a certain point, Disney said, we can't really justify it, because even lower budgeted movies, that's $30 million to make the negative cost of the film, and then at least another $30 million to sell that movie and put it in theaters. So it's not cheap. You have to, for what feels like a sort of an intimate, smaller movie, you still have to go out and make over $80 million to justify it. And that's hard. So they kind of went away. And it was sad, because there was just no more tolerance to sort of play that small ball. But now, with Disney Plus, they are saying, we want to make those movies again. We love those movies, we want to make them. We can make them for cheaper. Getting them to market is cheaper. Your distribution costs come back down to very little. Your marketing costs come down to very little. And so I now have, for the first time in a while, a couple things in development that would want to be in that subcategory. So I'm very excited about that. It's opened a window. I see, start back here and then we'll come over here.
I just want to tell you how much I love that movie.
Oh, thank you.
I love dogs, and I was so amazed how you could make the expression in their eyes and their faces when they were happy, when they were sad, when they were angry. I mean, you could just read it in their expression.
I'm glad that came through. I'll say this, there was a lot of pain and effort given to communicate those expressions in ways that real dogs do. Real dogs are very expressive. We didn't want to, in very few places do I think we did, sort of break the actual physiology of dogs, right? So we wanted to use basically from a checklist of things that we actually see those dogs doing, to use those and to not sort of break the model, as we say. And so I'm glad that came through.
So for students who are starting out, like they want to be a part of like animation and film sort of area, and they're trying to do like their personal improvement, or whether it's like drawing or something.
Yeah.
Is there one thing that you recommend for those students to for personal practice that was maybe impactful for you?
Sure. I mean, there's very, very different tracks. If you're talking about someone who's interested specifically in animation, back in the days when I would sketch things, I had loose ideas. I had a real affinity for animated movies. I never in my mind thought I'd be an animator. I just liked to doodle, and as Daryl said, it was oftentimes if I was sitting in church and the speaker wasn't too scintillating, I might be drawing then too. But it was more of a preoccupation and interest. But if someone's looking to do that, by the way, 2D animation is kind of a lost art. Everything we see now in the marketplace is 3D animation. It still very much is in need of real artists and people who are using 2D mediums to create character images and to create inspirational art. But then in the world of animation, it's really about people who are proficient on desktops in terms of animation software. And so I think getting used to all that stuff would make a lot of sense. And if you get really serious, you want to start looking early. There's a handful of places that really specialize. One of them is BYU now. Has an amazingly and difficult to get into animation program, but it really yields a lot of professionals. And then CalArts, and there's a couple of really hot spots. And you want to sort of look around and look at programs. And I'm certain that there are preparatory programs that you could get into. For me, obviously, as a producer, I don't have to be proficient in animation. I have to be proficient in trying to be a story editor from a creative standpoint, and to be sort of a manager when it comes to team leading. And so those things I just picked up over time. Maybe the scouting program helped me in that a little bit. But those are just some thoughts. Right back here, sir.
Yes. You mentioned how the big movies were squeezing out the smaller movies in the general market. Now that last logo that was on the screen, Disney was the big piece, but then underneath it was like Lucasfilm,
Star Wars, Pixar, Marvel, Disney, National Geographic,
How is that going to play out? That the big guys squeeze you out, or are you comfortable that you guys will still have a role?
Well, nothing lasts forever. But I think at the Disney company, the Disney label has a pretty strong argument. So I think that's there to stay, if that's what you mean. And you have, though, and the last acquisition was Fox Films, which included things like National Geographic, and Disney owns a different streaming platform called Hulu, where I think everything that's not branded in a specific way that you saw on that slide will be at Hulu. But it's interesting, and we're seeing in real time the way that certain attrition occurs. And over at Fox, you have a lot of different divisions within that studio, and they have what we call Big Fox, which is the main studio that produces movies. They used to have some of their own Marvel characters. They had a movie out this weekend called Ford versus Ferrari. They have, at Astra this year, they had other things. But that group already, I would tell you right now, is feeling the squeeze, because those are movies that are kind of, they don't fall into any certain category, they're not any certain brand, they're just sort of an eclectic slate of films, and they don't always work. And so I'm feeling those getting squeezed a little bit. There's another division at Fox called Fox Searchlight that specializes in movies that are like 25 million and under. And they're really targeting the art house crowds. That it's still robust, but it's small, it's at a scale. And I feel like they still have sort of a nice path in front of them to keep going. But so there's evolution to continue to happen. I think what you're seeing represented on that slide, all those brands have pretty good traction. I don't think they're in any jeopardy in the immediate future. But yeah, these a lot of the movies that just sit in the general slate coming from every other studio, it's not easy. It's not easy to cut through and to find ways to justify the cost. Yes, sir, over here.
Did you use some of the old music from the original film?
Yes. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I'll answer that.
That's great to know.
Yeah.
And as well, did you have to hire musicians, write new scores for different scenes? Or?
Yeah, we did. We had every intent to use all the original music, which is in there. There was Sonny Burke and Peggy Lee wrote 5 songs, 4 of which we used. We decided that one song did not age well, and we changed it, and that was the cat song. So we had a sequence with cats. We wrote a new song, and it's apparent why. But every other song, which included He's a Tramp, Bella Notte, Peace on Earth, and La La Lu, are all in there, and we stayed somewhat loyal to those. In fact, I got a really beautiful note from Holly Wells, who's Peggy Lee's granddaughter, who's my age, and she's a professional, she's in the business, but she watched it with keen interest and gave us a lovely note that was wonderful to read, because she felt like we've been really respectful of the music. And so we had a lot of different artists. We have a composer who both helped us in interpreting the existing songs and obviously wrote the original score that exists in this movie. And then we had Janelle Monáe, who's a singer-songwriter, and her writing team worked with us on writing a new cat song. And there's a brand new song that's in the end credits that I actually like a lot, that's just there for fun to play in the end credits. But she's a popular, singer in the world, but is also a burgeoning actress. But it was really fun. So we collaborated with her. We were able to go to New Orleans to capture, because we were a turn of the century, we wanted to sort of lean into this kind of jazzy Piedmont blues kind of sound to be somewhat accurate. And so we found the most amazing set of musicians there that perform and feature quite. And even later in the process when we were scoring, we brought some of them to LA to keep recording in the score. Yes, okay, so we should wrap it up. I feel bad saying let's wrap it up. So thank you for your time, and it's been fun being with you.